Hey everyone, this is Dr. Emily Scherning with American Resiliency, here with an up-to-date 2C climate forecast for all of our friends in Washington State. Folks, I know a lot of you have been waiting on this one. When I first got my hands on the NCA5, I noticed very quickly that the projections for Washington have changed amongst the most substantially of any state. We're going to go through these figures together, we're going to encounter some information that is upsetting, and we're going to talk about how to face the challenges ahead. If you are in the Eastern Washington destination region, we have detailed information that will be useful for your preparations. The destination region boundaries are unchanged, and the destination region looks strong. In Western Washington, we have important information about major emerging threats, as well as critical tipping point modeling. It's time to get ready. I'm sure that on the ground, you are also feeling this time of intense change. When I founded American Resiliency in 2021 and started making these climate outlooks, I called them 2050 climate forecasts. Back then, it seemed reasonable to think we'd hit 2C at mid-century. That was the consensus science. But that was then. 2023, as you know, it was a very serious year in climate. We hit 2C for a couple of days towards the end of the year, and we've been very close to 2C a couple of days so far here at the beginning of 2024. 2023 was the first full year we spent over 1.5C, breaking the threshold for the Paris Accords. So all of that should force us to change our thinking. You know as well as I do that so far this year, across much of the country, things have veered way off from normal seasonal patterns. This outlook, you have to understand, it's a 2C outlook. It's what we expect to see if we stick around 2C global warming over baseline. It does look like a La Nina system is forming, which is good news. Hopefully that'll pull the global temp down and buy us some more time. But it does look like we need to get ready for 2C sooner rather than later. Let's check out Washington's outlook at 2C. Just so you know where to find my source material, this forecast is based on the National Climate Assessment. This was just updated in November of 23. There have been significant changes in the projections in this new edition. I'm updating the outlooks for every state. And if you want to follow along, it's not hard. I recommend going to chapters and going down to all figures. It's worth noting you can download all of the figures. They download into a nice zip file, and then you can have this information at your fingertips off the internet. I'll tell you the number of every figure that I use, so you can go in and look at detailed projections for right where you live. I use the NCA5 because it represents the highest consensus climate science available. Your tax dollars paid for the development and review of this document. You deserve access to this information. As a matter of congressional mandate, there is no direct federal funding for communication to the public about the National Climate Assessment. This fact made me so mad that I founded American Resiliency, the only nonprofit focused on communicating this important information to the public. We run on your donations. Let's look at a national overview for changes at 2C. So here we are with figure 1.14, looking at the national overview for changes at 2C. We'll see that Washington here spans two change bands. Lower change by the coast, moderate change inland. So we expect less total heating in that lighter band, but it's not a big difference. You're talking about 3-4 degrees F versus 4-5 degrees F. But this doesn't give us the information we need to prepare for change on the ground. Let's look at changes to seasonal extremes and see if we can tell where that warm up is coming around the year. This is figure 2.11, where we're able to look at significant change patterns to heat and cold. And at a glance, we do see what looks like significant change patterns emerging in Washington State. We're going to start by looking at summer heat. So here we are with additional days over 95, and we do see additional days over 95 coming up from the Willamette Valley up into Washington. People in some parts of the country wouldn't sneeze at this. They might say, who's going to stress over 5 more hot days, which is what that light color means, is up to 5 additional days over 95. But folks, you got to understand, Centralia, Washington, right in the middle of the warming there, looking at maybe 5 more days over 95, currently has summer highs below 80. So this is a big change for a region that traditionally has had very temperate, mild summers. Anywhere that we see white on this map, that's an area where the temperature may be increasing in the summer. It's just not projected to hit 95 for additional days. As we get into the Palouse, we see some darker colors. We see that darkest color right in the center of the Palouse here down by the river. That's up to 25 additional days over 95 a year. However, in Kennewick, we often see highs today in the low 90s. A 95-degree day is not going to feel like such a shocker there. We see these darker colors in eastern Washington, a greater increase in days over 95. But I'm not convinced that the darker color here means a bigger impact. It's change, yes, but on this factor, it is likely to be a change that is not as stressful to your ecosystems as the unusual heat would feel to western Washington. Let's look over to warm nights. So you can see we're zoomed in on a different part of figure 2.11 now. This is increase in nights over 70. And we do see an increase in nights over 70 projected for most of the state. That pale color means up to 5 more nights over 70 projected. You've got a few more, up to 10 in the lower lying areas of eastern Washington, mostly along the river there. The little hot spot that you might see on that map, right there, I think that's Moses Lake. I think the water there is acting like a buffer, holding the heat in. Eastern Washington. These are warming conditions for the summer, right? But this is mild, especially when you compare it to other major agricultural areas. I think that those warm night increases across the state, including in Western Washington, we really need to think about what's normal for the region. Those additional nights over 70 in very temperate areas that did not see additional projected days over 95, I would take these warm nights as a warning signal that you will see days in at least the high 80s. So it's not cooling down so good at night. You can see there are a couple of places on the figure here that are white and that are also white for days over 95. Now let's look at the winter. So now we're zoomed in on 2.11 on loss of cold. This is your change in days at or below 32. So your loss of freezing days, this figure is really important. It's a big heads up. We see a lot of dark red on this figure for Washington, and the rate of change is higher as you go up the mountain. I want to contrast this to Maine for just a minute. You can see on Maine, this light spot is over the higher elevation areas, and we do see that in some places on the East Coast. You go up to where it's cold, it stays cold. Some visceral part of me, that's what I would expect. But we don't see that in Washington. Back to the Washington map here, we see the mountains changing the most at the top. The greatest warming you can see is over in Idaho. I think that's in the St. Joe Mountains. You could lose 50 days a year below 32 there. You could lose 50 days below 32 in the Cascades. On the Olympic Peninsula, we also see more than a month of cold loss. In the heart of the Palouse, you'll lose 2 to 3 weeks below freezing. That'll extend your shoulder season for growing. By Seattle, you can see very little cold loss, but you rarely get below 32, so it's not like that's a big surprise. Centralia, you didn't see much time below freezing in the winter, but it did happen. It looks like you will see very few days below freezing at 2C. This winter change in the mountains is very concerning for everyone in Washington. This is a big change from what we saw in the previous projections, a big difference. The impact of this change on landscapes, on fire risk, and on water supply is potentially quite serious. Let's look at projected change in plant hardiness zones to consider winter intensity as well as winter duration. So this is figure 11.3 in the report. You can see that there's a lot of information here and it's hard to see. We're going to go over to a snip that I made where we can look at present day to 2C and the key. All right, here we go. This is, again, a very substantial change from previous projection for changes in plant hardiness zones for Washington. It's an unusual level of variation as well. Eastern Washington, you look fabulous. It's mostly like a half zone shift here projected. That is unusual stability for an agricultural region. Most of us are looking at a full zone shift. You look really nice. Western Washington, this is hard to take in. You're looking at like a 1.5 zone shift by Seattle. Very unusual, very different from what we expected. I do want to point out a little hope here. I want to point out good relative stability right in the high point of the Olympic Peninsula. We shouldn't give up hope yet. The cold loss on the Olympic Peninsula, it's going to be shorter, but the winter's going to be squeezed around like a high tight peak. If you look over to the Cascades, we see a bigger change in intensity as well as that big change in duration. Typical low temperatures we see going up on this figure. Again, that's a big change in the Cascades, and it's a big difference from what we saw in the NCA4 projections. We absolutely need to talk about water now. We need to understand water to understand what is going on and what will this level of change mean for Washington. Let's look at figure 210. All right, I've got 210 placed so that you can see the change at 2 and the change at 3 because you are not stable between 2 and 3 degrees of warming. It looks like at 2, there may be a blessing of rain called down the Columbia River. We can see a projected 10% increase in rain falling over what I think is the Columbia River watershed up there from the north in eastern Washington. Over the Olympic Peninsula, also, we see 5% more precipitation in the outlook at 2C. Where you see crosshatching, it's expected for those changes to be statistically significant to be coming year over year. We do need more rain in Washington to deal with that increased heat. Let's try to understand this better. Let's get more detail with another model. We're going over to figure 4.3. Looking at 4.3, which you can see that this is like an ensemble model. And look, there is pretty good conservation of actually more precipitation coming to Washington, even in the driest percent of projections. So I feel like we've got some hope here. We've got some rational hope to think that there will be more inches of precipitation coming to the area. We see again more potential hope for the Olympic Peninsula. They might be getting enough additional water to deal with the plant needs for that kind of increased heat we're expecting across the region. If you look down in Oregon, we see, though, a water deficit forming in the Willamette Valley and extending up into Washington. We see above that line increased rain falling, more inches of rain across most of Washington, with the total greatest in the mountains, in those high change mountains. This matches up very closely with figure 4.5. Let's go over there and look at snow water deficit. You'll see here in figure 4.5, you're looking at about a 5-inch snow water deficit in most of these places where you're getting about 5 additional inches of rain. So we're expecting to see more precipitation falling as rain instead of snow, with a modest total increase in precipitation for most of our highly impacted areas. Now, I want to show you a figure that's kind of complicated. I want to show you figure 4.6. Over here in 4.6, I don't show it much because it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. It's about how much moisture is projected to be in the soil in the summer. Most of the country, you can see there's going to be soil moisture deficit. Some places where you might think you're seeing a positive change, like in the Southwest here, it's really not positive. It's that the projected heat increases are so extreme that you expect more of these plants to die. So this positive here, it's actually like water could be going into the aquifers to heal the aquifers. It's not more water that's really available for plants to drink. But you see potential ability to grow more plants here across the prairie pothole region, and we see it forming up in the Palouse. Eastern Washington, you've got what it takes. You've got a shot at increased soil moisture and conditions where you can get stuff growing. I think that you are by far the strongest agricultural region shaping up outside of the Midwest. There's a lot of scary stuff in this outlook, but if you're digging in Eastern Washington, keep going. And if you're thinking about it, if you're thinking about building your resilience, now's the time to get ready. Eastern Washington can do it. I'm really happy for you guys. This is a minor point, but I want to show you figure 14.6. I know that on the West Coast, many people worry about air quality. Eastern Washington, of course, because you're used to this high fire danger, you worry about air quality. I want to show you from a pollen perspective, you're expecting much better pollen counts inland than we anticipate by the coast in Washington state. There's a big split here in the state level outlook on pollen concentrations. Let's take a look at extreme storm trend. Before we hit the normal extreme storm trend figure, I want to emphasize that for this region, atmospheric rivers are a particular hazard. They're expected to become more frequent, more powerful, and to extend further inland. We don't have exact models for these pathways available through the NCA5. Here in 27.1, you can kind of see what an atmospheric river looks like if you're from a place like over by me where we don't see them, that there are these powerful, intense rivers of water vapor that form in the atmosphere and come and hit land. They used to be pretty confined. Now we're expecting them to go way down to LA and pretty far up into Canada and just really hose the whole West Coast in an unpredictable way as temperatures increase. So you're going to be getting major precipitation events along that pathway. In 2.12 here, we're going to look not at those patterns, but at other types of storms. All right, so here we are in 2.12. We're looking at changes in precipitation extremes, but we're really talking more about precipitation extremes from like thunderstorms than atmospheric river type storms, is my understanding of this figure. You can see this figure has a lot going on. So I look for conserved signal. The only strong conserved signal across these three models is over the Olympic Peninsula. Zooming in here on the 5-year max, this area, we do see conserved signals across the models, looking at maybe 15% more rain dropped in precipitation events. Increased deluge type rain is likely to a degree over the state. The storms are going to be dropping 5%, 10% more water. Let's look at your flood risks related to that. We can look at that through the cost of flooding. We're going over to figure 110. I think it's interesting looking at 110 that in this county where we saw the biggest concentration of extreme storms, we do see increased flooding expected. But most of the big flooding increases that we see look like they're probably going to be riverine flooding. With that additional water coming down the Columbia, we would expect more riverine flooding, and that's an important resilience point to consider in that very strong region shaping up in eastern Washington. Your 500-year flood mark for the Columbia, it's going to go up. If you're a generational thinker, you want to place your house well away from the river. It looks like deluge-based flooding is also a resilience concern for Spokane. We do see flooding over by the coast. We're going to look at some details for the coast in a minute when we look at sea level rise. When we talk about precipitation changes in Washington, we're talking about a very different water cycle in this area. It is not trivial. The local hydrology will be changed. Across much of the state, you're looking at a rapid transition from snow-fed to rain-fed water systems. Especially in the dry parts of the state, this rowdy, more abruptly melting, more come as rain surface water, you might expect to see some pretty dramatic erosion. There's also the fact that snowmelt water is cold. A stream that's fed by snowmelt can radiate a powerful cold, right? High up in the mountains in July, in August, you can feel cold boiling out of snowmelt fed streams. This is a very serious outlook for cold water ecosystems and cold water fish species. As we're talking about water, let's go over to the ocean. We see in figure 9.2 that sea level rise is projected to be not a huge deal at 2050, less than a foot, and mild compared to other parts of the country at 2100, like less than 3 feet. Now, these projections are complicated by the fact that we're seeing the Earth have days at 2C over pre-industrial baseline now. So the sea will rise faster than these figures indicate, most likely, but like it's not going to be instantaneous sea level rise. If we see AMOC collapse in the next 5 years, say, which there's increasingly concern about that in the climate science community, that's a really big change, by the way, for the community to be thinking that near-term AMOC collapse is looking like a real possibility. This is a huge shift in mainstream climate science thinking after 2023. Even in 2022, most scientists would have thought that was a really out there possibility to happen before 2100. But this is now, right? If we see AMOC collapse in the next 5 years, we would need to model over 10 feet of sea level rise because of the severe ice melt we would expect in Antarctica. So for this outlook today, we're going to model at 2 feet and at 10 feet. My reasoning is that gives us like a 20-year view if AMOC does not go down and we just see sea level rise through normal expected warming. It gives us a 20-year view if AMOC does go down and we see that very rapid, intense sea level rise. Let's check out the NOAA sea level rise viewer. Here we go. Let's look at Washington at 2 feet. You don't see the same level of dramatic change at 2 feet for Washington that you see in state Florida. Zooming in on Seattle here. We see some mild damage, some squishiness starts appearing at the port at 2 feet. Here's Tacoma. Same story. 2 feet, things are getting like kind of squishy. These marshy areas appearing. That means you should have some concerns about salt water getting into soil and into freshwater reserves. A lot of people in this area have shallow wells. You could experience saltwater inundation into the freshwater supply. Olympia, I want to show you. At 2 feet, you look great. Port Angeles, 2 feet, same story. You're going to have some beach loss at 2 feet, but the land sets pretty steep to the water most places in this part of the world. Look over here, though, at a low-lying place. Let's look at Brant Point. This area here is so gorgeous. It's gentle slope, agricultural, small community. You can see that the damage here at 2 feet, this really changes these gentle places in Washington. Even at 2 feet, you get really intense damage to these gentle places, and important wildlife habitat is lost. The story is the same around Grays Harbor, these gentle places. At 2 feet, we see serious damage to these agricultural areas around Grays Harbor. A lot of the housing stock is going to be damaged more from the incursion, more from the increasing marshiness than from direct inundation. You can see it here. Now we got to look at 10. If we have AMOC collapse, we have to face what's going to happen to these gentle places at 10 feet of sea level rise. You can see it as catastrophic. At Brant Point, at 10 feet, we also see catastrophic loss of housing, damage to agricultural areas, damage to soil, loss of critical wildlife habitat. Port Angeles, if you have been here, this land loss at the harbor at 10 feet of sea level rise really makes sense. All the housing up there, it's up on a big height. All of these folks, their homes will be safe at 10, but the port is critical for the life of the community. Let's go look over at Olympia. Olympia, you can see that at 10 feet of sea level rise, your loss is actually quite limited. It looks like you have a severe loss of industrial areas, but not of your housing. So if you see continued signs of AMOC collapse coming soon, coming in the next 5 to 10 years, if you clean up these industrial areas in advance of sea level rise, that's going to be critical to supporting the long-term health, sustainability, and resilience of your community. If the water comes up and it's not a major pollution event, your ability to support life in your waters, to harvest sustainably from these waters, will be much greater. In Tacoma, we see a very similar challenge in the event of AMOC collapse and severe sea level rise. You can see that at 10 feet in Tacoma, the port is gone. The impact on reservation lands also is very severe. The Air Force Base appears to be safe, as does most of the housing. So this is an extremely disruptive scenario, right? But just like for Olympia, your community, if you have a plan in place for industrial cleanup and retreat around the port as a primary focus of resources and action in the event of AMOC collapse, it will be so important for your sustainability in the event of that tragedy, which would make food production local and critical. You have an edge to hold here. When you see this, you know what you need to do. Seattle, inland at 10 feet. Lake Forest Park is eating stuff. It's kind of hard to see the boundary. But if you zoom in here and let's go down. Yeah, down to the mean high water mark. Look at all of these places on the margin. They're starting to get eaten. We're starting to see more standing water over in the slough. We're starting to see some houses take damage pretty far inland. Coming back out, we see substantial damage to the port. We see that the stadium is gone. A lot of downtown is directly inundated. Massive damage to Seattle at 10 feet of sea level rise. The whole Duwamish waterway is just getting huge. Looking at it at current, looking at it at 10 feet, it's just enormous and taking water very far inland that's going to have some salt concentration. All the way to the Boeing complex, all the way out here to Renton, we would expect serious impacts at 10 feet of sea level rise for the Seattle area. This is a big lift. All right, we can all agree that Seattle-sized lift is pretty intense. I think that it's clear to everyone, if we're dealing with this extreme sea level rise scenario that we'd have in the event of AMOC collapse, that cleaning up port and industrial sites is critical to the future of Western Washington. I want to take a minute, though. I want to focus on something that's not a Seattle-sized lift. I want to look at Whidbey Island for a minute. We got a lot of folks who live on those islands in Puget Sound on the channel. Whidbey Island is representative of what's going to be happening to most of the islands. And my husband's a Navy kid. He grew up there. Let's look at Oak Harbor. Oak Harbor, this is not so bad at 10 feet. You can see that most of the housing stock is okay, and you do see a lot of change. You see a lot of the current natural areas, a lot of the current seaplane base areas are severely impacted. But when we look at the change landscape here, we see that change is possible. If you look, there's new wildlife habitat emerging that is going to be very important. If you look here, at Cranberry Lake, we can see it has a lot of inundation and a lot of these islands that are critical habitat for seabirds. If we look down here at the meanly named Useless Bay, we can see that Useless Bay looks like it might be becoming fairly useful in this scenario. Now, I'm sorry, folks. This whole thing, it's hands down very serious and it's hard to see. We can look over at figure 10.2. We know that big changes are happening in the oceans and that they're severe and painful. I feel it hard even to mention the degree to which we've seen the loss of the kelp forest up and down the West Coast. The damage that we have done is terrible. Honestly, there are ways that I have a very simplistic, animistic take on this, which is that the ocean is mad. The climate pathway we've been on, the changes to the ocean have been bigger so far than the changes to the land. The ocean is suffering more than the land. If AMOC collapses, if we hit that tipping point, the pain, the changes, are going to originate in the ocean. And we can see that the ocean's response to this injury will be profound. You take a little break if you want to. We're going to look at the fire map next. That's complex information we're going to go through on the fire map. So here we are on the fire map, figure 7.4. It's important to note that this is a hard figure to read. So this is your proportionate increase These are your historical number of days where you had the conditions associated with very large fires. So you have to do math to figure out what your projected future conditions are. You have to multiply this number by this number for where you are. We can see that in the Palouse, you did have like half a day a year where there were like seriously bad fire conditions. Now it's going to be more like a day and a half a year where there's potential for a really bad fire. All around this area here on the first figure, all of these areas here that are sort of yellowy color, those used to have fire conditions like every 10 years. Now they're going to have fire conditions every 2 years, every 3 years. So this is danger, but this map here does not mean constantly on fire. By the coast, we see that it's in white. That doesn't mean you're out of danger. It means not modeled. Not modeled means that they didn't calculate it for you. It means they didn't take it into account. On the coast, they didn't take it into account because it's so recent that the threat of fire should emerge in these forests. I've been in the Hull. It was a dream of mine since childhood to go to the Hull. And how could anyone go there and think that that place could burn? But I called a number of fire risks in my first generation outlooks, even before I had a resource like that figure to feel certain. Other areas where I called the fire risk early, I feel confident now that I called them correctly, and we need to make a call now about fire risk towards the coast. The level of winter stress that we're seeing on the coastal rainforest, the pictures people are sending me throughout the area, the stress on these ecosystems are evident and concerning. We need to think about fire in those unmodeled areas. We need to think about fire resilience in our communities, and we need to think about what the fire would mean for landscape transition. Washington, let's take a minute together. Let's review and talk action steps. There are so many factors where the projections for Washington State look very different in the NCA5. The heat projections, the water projections, the plant hardiness zones projections, they are all coming together in ways that will significantly impact beloved landscapes. So many of us, so many people look to Washington State as a beacon of hope and as a model of action. And it still is a beacon of hope, even in these more challenging projections. When I called Eastern Washington as one of the 3 destination regions, many people were skeptical. In the revised projections, Eastern Washington remains a major stronghold. It doesn't have the capacity of the upper Midwest, but it looks great. The Palouse looks even stronger than it did before. The destination area of the Northeast in the NCA5 projections, it has decreased in quality and shrunk substantially. Eastern Washington's destination area boundaries are unchanged, and its water outlook is, if anything, improved. Those of you by the coast in Washington, previous models indicated you were secure against fire. You saw fire risk is not modeled now. White on that map, 7.4 means not modeled, means nothing was calculated. But many of you have been in touch with me asking me to send up a distress call. To prepare for fire on the coast, you were correct. We must build resilience against wildfire on the coast. This is terrible news, but please remember, your modeled climate remains extremely survivable, conditions under which many life forms can thrive, including humans. The threat of fire in these forests is enough to break the heart, but we can't afford to stop there because our grief is not the most important point of our focus. If this landscape transforms, we need to stay with it, we need to care for it and help nurture what comes next. That potential transformation is a critical area for study and action. Additional actions are required in Western Washington. Along the coast, we have a great deal of industrial infrastructure. For generational resilience, cleanup is critical. Paying attention to the potential impacts of rising seas on freshwater sources and soil is also critical. Most homes in coastal Washington will not be impacted by sea level rise. If we were to proceed along our current warming pathway, sea level rise would not be a huge deal for most of Washington. Our concern could focus on communities around beaches and in gentle low-lying areas. In these communities of concern, it'll be a true emergency if AMOC tips. If the signs come out that AMOC is down, you got to get out. You got to sell your house and get out before the local real estate market collapses. It's very important. If we see for sure signs that AMOX has tipped, these areas, like by Grays Harbor, are areas where you're going to have to list your house as soon as you hear, because I think that there will be a tendency to suppress that information because there's a lot of investment, right, in business as usual. People aren't going to want to promote the fact that we've gone over a tipping point. So we have to keep our ear to the ground and listen in. I really think that there are going to be a few seasons where you might be able to pull some value out of your home before the area goes under. I think there will be a small window where you can pull out enough value to move, and I'm going to be keeping an eye on it to try and get that distress signal out if it should come. This isn't saying that it's come now. It's saying that this is a thing we have to look at, and we can see where our most vulnerable people are, and we can work on being ready to get the word out if the damage comes. So stay alert, Washington. For your state, this tipping point our climate system is flirting with is very important. If AMOC collapses, your area will get colder, your snowpack could normalize, your hydrology could move towards normalization. The fires might not come. I had that detailed AMOC modeling video a little while ago where we saw there's an unusual signal that coastal Washington might get more precipitation in the event of AMOC collapse, in contrast to the mild drought trend that would impact most of the rest of the US. So, like, there's a real differential there. Like all of those things sound good if AMOC tips, but you would also experience this profound destruction by water that we've modeled in this video. Eastern Washington, it's worth noting, if AMOC collapses, you still model very well, as does the Prairie Pothole region. Washington, I'm sorry to bring you such a difficult message. This is serious news. I know from many of you who have written me that you feel this change, that you feel that over the last couple of years, things are changing in a different way, more than we expected, more than consensus science expected. I know that for many of you, even this information, if it feels like a shock, seeing as in the figures, it's not a surprise, right? So we need to keep moving forward. Don't get stuck in your grief. These are survivable conditions, and the land and the water need our work more than they need our grief. We need to take action to protect them. And the people, you people in Washington State, have the knowledge and experience, the work ethic, and the willingness to do what it takes. We've all seen it. We're all inspired by your heroic work towards restoring the salmon, towards restoring the watersheds, towards hitting towards net zero. You guys are the model in emissions reduction, and we're all rooting for you. Keep an eye on your hope. Stay alert and be ready to jump and help spread the word in sensitive areas. That's an important communications mission. We all got to get our game faces on now. Let's get ready. Folks, thanks for watching and thanks for joining us. AR has recently passed a milestone. We've reached more than 100,000 people in America with detailed local climate information, and it's thanks to the incredible support of the AR community. There are so many folks committing their financial resources, their energy, their time to helping this information get out there. I'm so grateful to all of you, and I'm so glad that we're doing this together. Thanks for being there with me. I'm going to keep an eye on the news. I'm going to keep an eye on high consensus science. I'm going to try and get you what you need as we go through this together.